In 1960, Soviet tourists to the United States stared in disbelief at what Americans considered utterly mundane, a refrigerator in every home. These gleaming white boxes, standing tall in millions of kitchens across suburban America, became unexpected symbols in the ideological battleground of the Cold War. For Americans, they were simply appliances. For Soviet visitors, they represented an impossible luxury, a tangible contradiction to decades of propaganda about capitalist inequality, and evidence of a standard of living that their own superpower nation had failed to deliver despite promises of communist prosperity. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. While 85% of American homes boasted refrigerators by 1960, fewer than 4% of Soviet households had access to this technology. The typical Soviet citizen, upon hearing about refrigerators, imagined them exclusively in shops, restaurants, or perhaps the homes of high-ranking party officials. The concept that an average factory worker, teacher, or office clerk would own such an appliance was simply unfathomable. This reality check created an unexpected diplomatic challenge for Soviet authorities, as returning tourists began whispering about the material abundance they had witnessed in the supposed enemy state. The seeds of this cultural collision were planted on June 25, 1959, at the American National Exhibition in Moscow's Sokolniki Park. There, in what would become known as the Kitchen Debate, Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stood in a model American kitchen surrounded by the latest appliances. Nixon proudly showcased the refrigerator, washing machine, and television set, while Khrushchev dismissed these as gadgets designed to take women's money. "Don't you have a machine that puts food into the mouth and pushes it down?" Khrushchev asked sarcastically. Nixon, sensing a pivotal moment, replied that America's strength lay not in weapons but in improving the lives of ordinary citizens through consumer choice and convenience. What neither leader fully anticipated was how this moment would ripple outward when actual Soviet citizens began visiting American homes in 1960 as part of the newly expanded cultural exchange programs. These exchanges, born from a slight thaw in Cold War relations following Stalin's death, were designed primarily for scientific and educational purposes. However, they inadvertently became reconnaissance missions into everyday American life, with Soviet visitors documenting the shocking abundance they encountered. The context for these visits was a world still deeply divided by ideology and mistrust. The 1950s had witnessed the Korean War, the Hungarian Revolution's brutal suppression, and the acceleration of nuclear weapons development on both sides. By 1960, both superpowers maintained massive conventional forces in Europe, with thousands of nuclear warheads ready for deployment. Yet beneath this military standoff, a different type of competition was gaining importance: the battle for hearts and minds through living standards and consumer goods. The Soviet Union had staked its legitimacy on the promise that collectivized economic planning would eventually overtake capitalism in production efficiency, allowing for greater equality in distribution. Since the 1917 revolution, Soviet citizens had endured tremendous hardships: civil war, Stalin's purges, the devastating losses of World War II, with the promise that material prosperity would eventually follow. By the late 1950s, Khrushchev had promised that the Soviet Union would catch and overtake America in per capita production, boldly claiming this would happen within a decade. These promises made the refrigerator revelation particularly devastating. The Soviet visitors in 1960 weren't merely impressed by American refrigerators, they were stunned by their ubiquity. These weren't the privilege of the wealthy few, they were standard equipment in modest homes across class lines. One Soviet engineer noted in his private journal, later confiscated by authorities, "The worker we visited lives better than our factory director. His refrigerator was larger than the one in our institute's laboratory. How can we compete when their working class lives like our elite?" The timing couldn't have been worse for Soviet propaganda. The year 1960 marked a high point in America's post-war consumer revolution. The U.S. economy had been transformed by wartime production, and manufacturers had successfully converted to civilian goods after 1945. The rapid expansion of suburban housing through initiatives like the GI Bill had created millions of new households needing appliances. Manufacturers like General Electric, Frigidaire, and Westinghouse had dramatically expanded production, bringing economies of scale that lowered prices. A refrigerator that would have cost the equivalent of 4 months' salary for an average American worker in 1940 now required less than 3 weeks' pay. Against this backdrop, Soviet tourists found themselves in American supermarkets confronting another revelation: food abundance. The average American supermarket in 1960 stocked approximately 6,000 items compared to the few hundred found in the best-supplied Soviet stores. Without home refrigeration, Soviet shopping was a daily affair, with citizens often standing in multiple lines to secure basic provisions. American refrigerators weren't just appliances, they represented freedom from daily shopping, the ability to store leftovers, to buy in bulk when prices were favorable, and to preserve seasonal produce, practical advantages that transcended ideology. The Soviet visitors came from diverse backgrounds: scientists, artists, educators, and industrial specialists, but shared a common characteristic: they were trusted representatives of the system, carefully vetted by authorities. Many held Communist Party membership and had distinguished themselves professionally. They were expected to observe American technical achievements that might be adaptable to Soviet needs while remaining ideologically steadfast. None were prepared for how profoundly ordinary household technology would challenge their worldview. Yuri Gagarin, who would soon become the first human in space, visited the United States as part of a delegation of aviation specialists in late 1959. While his technical brilliance and party loyalty were unquestioned, even he remarked to a colleague, "Their ordinary homes have better food preservation than our hospitals." The comment, reported by a vigilant minder, was stricken from his official report, but speaks to how even the most dedicated Soviet citizens found themselves questioning certain aspects of the comparative development between the superpowers. The disconnect between Soviet propaganda and observed reality created cognitive dissonance for the visitors. For decades, Soviet citizens had been told that Americans lived in a society of extreme inequality, where a few wealthy capitalists enjoyed luxury, while the masses struggled for necessities. The refrigerator challenged this narrative directly. It was a substantial purchase, yet clearly within reach of the American working class. As one Soviet journalist privately noted, "If this is how their proletariat lives, then what exactly are we fighting against?" Not all Soviet visitors were immediately convinced. Some suspected they were being shown only the best neighborhoods, or that American hosts had been specially selected and their homes prepared for these visits. This skepticism wasn't entirely unwarranted. The American government did indeed hope to impress Soviet visitors with American prosperity. However, the sheer consistency of refrigerator ownership across diverse neighborhoods and socioeconomic levels eventually overwhelmed even the most dedicated skeptics. A Soviet textile worker named Nina Petrovna, selected for her exemplary factory output, wrote in her official report, "The American working-class neighborhoods resemble what we would consider elite housing in Moscow. The kitchens are fully equipped with refrigerators, stoves, and even machines that automatically wash dishes. When I asked how they afforded such things, they showed me payment plans and credit systems. They do not seem to consider refrigerators as luxury items, but as normal necessities." The official Soviet response to these observations was multifaceted. Publicly, authorities emphasized that American consumer abundance came at the cost of exploitation, both of American workers and of developing nations. They highlighted racial discrimination, poverty in Appalachia, and urban ghettos, and the lack of guaranteed employment or health care. Privately, however, Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership accelerated plans to improve consumer goods production, recognizing the political danger of falling too far behind in visible living standards. The Soviet refrigerator industry itself tells a revealing story. The first Soviet refrigerator factory had been established in 1939, but production was minimal and immediately disrupted by World War II. When manufacturing resumed after the war, refrigerators were produced in small numbers and often reserved for collective use in apartment buildings rather than individual ownership. The first mass-produced Soviet home refrigerator, the Saratov, didn't enter production until 1951, and even then, annual output was measured in thousands rather than the millions being produced in America. For Soviet economic planners, this disparity reflected conscious prioritization rather than failure. Resources had been directed toward heavy industry, military development, and infrastructure projects deemed essential for national security and basic development. Consumer goods were considered secondary luxuries that could wait until the industrial foundation was secured. As one Soviet planning document from 1953 stated, "The capitalist system requires constant stimulation of artificial consumer demand to prevent economic collapse. Socialist planning allows us to focus on essential development first, with consumer conveniences to follow naturally as productive capacity increases." This explanation, however, provided little comfort to ordinary Soviet citizens who had been waiting decades for the promised improvements in daily life. The refrigerator became a potent symbol of this unfulfilled promise. While Americans were purchasing second-generation refrigerators with automatic defrosting and separate freezer compartments, most Soviet citizens still preserved food using traditional methods, keeping perishables on window sills during winter months, preserving summer produce through canning, or using rural root cellars. The reality of this technological gap contradicted the Soviet narrative of scientific and industrial superiority. The nation that had launched Sputnik in 1957, demonstrating advanced rocket technology that genuinely alarmed American military planners, couldn't produce a basic household refrigerator at scale. This contradiction was not lost on ordinary citizens, who increasingly asked why their scientific achievements in space weren't translating to improvements in daily life. The American refrigerator industry, meanwhile, had followed a dramatically different trajectory. Mass production began in the 1920s, with companies like Frigidaire, owned by General Motors, and Kelvinator leading the market. The initial technology was expensive and limited to wealthy households, but production scaled rapidly. By 1940, approximately 60% of American urban households had refrigerators, though rural electrification lagged. The post-war economic boom, combined with the electrification of nearly all American homes by the mid-1950s, created conditions for near-universal refrigerator ownership by 1960. This achievement wasn't merely industrial, but infrastructural and commercial. Reliable electrical grids, standardized voltage, credit financing, competitive markets, and a distribution network of department stores and appliance retailers all contributed to the refrigerator's ubiquity. The Soviet system, with its centralized planning, frequent electrical supply problems, and absence of consumer credit, struggled to replicate this ecosystem even when the technical knowledge of refrigeration was available. When Soviets visitors returned home and shared their observations, sometimes officially, sometimes in whispered conversations with trusted friends, the refrigerator story became part of a larger underground narrative about American life that contradicted official propaganda. These accounts spread through what Russians called kitchen talk, private conversations in the one space where Soviet citizens felt relatively safe from surveillance. Ironically, these conversations often happened in kitchens lacking the very refrigerators being discussed. The Soviet leadership was not oblivious to this growing credibility gap. Internal reports acknowledged the problem, with one KGB assessment from 1961 warning, returning delegates from capitalist countries, particularly the United States, are spreading dangerous misconceptions about consumer availability in these societies. While we can control official reports, personal communications are creating unrealistic expectations among ordinary workers about the standard of living they should expect under socialism. The political implications were significant. The Soviet system justified many of its restrictions on personal freedom with the promise of material security and eventual prosperity. If capitalism was demonstrably delivering better living standards to ordinary workers, what was the rationale for the sacrifices Soviet citizens were asked to make? This question would haunt Soviet leadership throughout the 1960s and beyond, eventually contributing to the systemic reforms attempted under Mikhail Gorbachev 2 decades later. American officials, meanwhile, quickly recognized the psychological impact of household technology on Soviet visitors. The United States Information Agency, USIA, began specifically incorporating home visits into cultural exchange itineraries, ensuring that Soviet delegations would see not just scientific laboratories and cultural landmarks, but ordinary American kitchens. As one USIA report noted, the refrigerator has proven more persuasive than any propaganda film we could produce. The Central Intelligence Agency similarly noted the importance of consumer goods in psychological warfare. A 1960 assessment stated, Soviet visitors typically express greater surprise at American supermarkets and household appliances than at our industrial or military capabilities. These observations appear to create significant cognitive dissonance regarding Soviet economic claims. This vulnerability should be exploited through expanded exchange programs focused on everyday living standards rather than exceptional achievements. The Soviet authorities responded to this challenge with a multi-pronged approach. First, they increased investment in consumer goods production, with Khrushchev announcing ambitious targets for refrigerator manufacturing in the 7-year plan, 1959 to 1965. Second, they tightened control over who could participate in exchange programs, selecting participants less for their professional qualifications and more for their ideological reliability. Third, they developed counter-narratives emphasizing the social costs of American consumer culture, particularly debt, advertising manipulation, and psychological discontent. This third approach was exemplified in a series of articles published in Pravda throughout 1961, with titles like The Myth of American Prosperity and The Emptiness Behind the Facade. These pieces acknowledged American material abundance, but portrayed it as a superficial distraction from deeper social problems. One particularly notable article argued, the American refrigerator is indeed impressive, but consider what it represents, a society where food must be hoarded because one never knows when employment might end, where families rarely gather for meals because everyone works different hours, where natural flavors are lost through freezing and processing. While such arguments resonated with some ideologically committed Soviets, they increasingly fell flat with ordinary citizens who simply wanted the convenience of food preservation. By the early 1960s, a refrigerator had joined the automobile and personal apartment as the troika of consumer aspirations for the Soviet middle class. The waiting list for refrigerators in Moscow stores stretched for years, with connected individuals using BLAT, the informal system of favors and connections, to secure these coveted appliances outside official channels. The impact extended beyond material envy to deeper questions about economic systems. Soviet economists, many of whom had access to restricted Western publications, began quietly questioning aspects of centralized planning that had failed to deliver basic consumer technologies. Some proposed limited market reforms, particularly for consumer goods, though such discussions remained confined to academic circles until much later. The refrigerator gap exposed fundamental issues in the Soviet approach to production and distribution that would never be fully resolved. For American officials, the refrigerator represented a perfect Cold War weapon. It highlighted systemic differences without requiring explicit propaganda. When Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin visited the General Electric refrigerator factory in Louisville, Kentucky in 1965, his American hosts simply let the production numbers speak for themselves. The factory produced more refrigerators in a month than the entire Soviet Union manufactured in a year. No ideological argument could compete with such concrete disparities. The refrigerator also represented something more fundamentally American, the democratization of luxury. Items that had once been exclusive to the wealthy had, through mass production and widespread prosperity, become available to ordinary citizens. This pattern, repeated across numerous products from automobiles to televisions, embodied the American promise of upward mobility and broad-based prosperity. It contrasted sharply with the Soviet approach, where access to superior goods remained tightly linked to political position and special privilege, despite rhetoric about equality. By 1962, the gap had become so evident that it featured prominently in the Soviet leadership's internal deliberations. Anastas Mikoyan, a senior Soviet official responsible for trade and consumer goods, argued in a Politburo meeting, "We cannot continue to tell our people that they must sacrifice for industrial development when that development isn't improving their daily lives. The Americans have demonstrated that advanced industry and consumer abundance can coexist. We must shift some resources toward visible improvements in living standards or risk growing disillusionment." This reality was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal from ordinary Soviet citizens. While travel to the West remained restricted to trusted delegates and officials, information increasingly penetrated through other channels. Western radio broadcasts, particularly Voice of America and Radio Liberty, specifically highlighted the material disparities between ordinary citizens in both systems. American films, carefully selected for Soviet distribution, nevertheless revealed background details of everyday American life that astute viewers noted. Foreign exhibitions, though controlled, offered glimpses of Western consumer technologies that created lasting impressions. Perhaps most importantly, as the 1960s progressed, the circle of Soviets who had personally witnessed American living standards widened. Each returning delegate shared observations with family members and trusted friends, creating an expanding network of first-hand accounts that contradicted official narratives. As one KGB report from 1964 noted with alarm, despite briefings about maintaining appropriate perspectives, returning citizens are sharing ideologically harmful observations about capitalist living standards. The cumulative effect is undermining confidence in our economic achievements. The refrigerator story thus transcended the appliance itself to become a powerful metaphor in the Cold War battle of systems. For Americans, it validated the fundamental premise that free enterprise, despite its inequalities, delivered material benefits to ordinary citizens more effectively than centralized planning. For Soviets, it raised uncomfortable questions about whether the decades of sacrifice for socialist development would ever produce the promised results. For both societies, the refrigerator became a tangible measure of success or failure in the competition to win global hearts and minds. As American and Soviet officials met in high-level diplomatic negotiations throughout the 1960s, the refrigerator gap remained an unspoken but understood context. When Soviet negotiators took hardline positions or made demands, their American counterparts knew that behind the public facade lay a system struggling to satisfy basic consumer aspirations. This knowledge provided subtle leverage in negotiations ranging from arms control to trade relations. The concrete reality of American refrigerators in ordinary homes undermined Soviet claims to representing a superior economic model. By the mid-1960s, Soviet leaders had reluctantly acknowledged the need to shift resources toward consumer production. The economic reforms implemented under Alexei Kosygin in 1965 explicitly aimed to increase the availability of household goods with refrigerators high on the priority list. Production did increase substantially, rising from approximately 529,000 refrigerators in 1960 to nearly 5.6 million annually by 1970. While impressive, this growth still left the Soviet Union far behind the United States in per capita ownership and availability. The refrigerator gap illuminated deeper structural differences between the competing systems. American refrigerator development had been driven by competition among multiple manufacturers, each seeking market advantage through innovation, price reductions, or new features. By 1960, American consumers could choose from dozens of models with varying capacities, features, and price points. Soviet refrigerator production, in contrast, focused on standardized models produced according to central planning directives. Innovation occurred slowly, with new features introduced primarily when they reduced production costs rather than in response to consumer preferences. This distinction reflected fundamentally different approaches to economic organization. The American system, with its emphasis on consumer sovereignty and market competition, excelled at producing and distributing the goods people actually wanted. The Soviet system, organized around production targets and central allocation, could mobilize resources for priority projects, but struggled to align production with consumer desires. As refrigerators shifted from luxury items to expected necessities, this weakness in the Soviet approach became increasingly problematic. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the refrigerator remained an aspirational purchase throughout the 1960s. Those fortunate enough to acquire one often celebrated with a housewarming-like gathering, inviting friends and relatives to admire the new acquisition. Photographs from the period frequently show proud owners posing beside their refrigerators, treating them with the reverence Americans might reserve for a new car. The refrigerator, more than almost any other item, symbolized having made it in Soviet society, achieving a level of domestic comfort that previous generations could only dream about. Behind this individual aspiration lay a deeper societal shift. The Soviet system had been built on revolutionary fervor and collective sacrifice, with personal comfort considered bourgeois and secondary to societal progress. By the 1960s, however, that revolutionary generation was aging, and younger Soviets increasingly measured progress through material improvements rather than ideological milestones. When Khrushchev promised that the current generation would live under communism, many citizens interpreted this concretely. They expected apartments, automobiles, and yes, refrigerators. The gap between these expectations and Soviet reality created growing political pressure. While few citizens openly questioned the socialist system itself, many began to demand that it deliver on its material promises. Letters to Soviet newspapers and government offices increasingly focused on consumer shortages and quality problems, rather than abstract ideological concerns. Party officials found themselves judged not by their revolutionary credentials or ideological purity, but by their ability to improve local living standards and increase access to desired goods. As 1968 approached, with tension growing across Eastern Europe and challenges to Soviet authority emerging in Czechoslovakia, the seemingly mundane issue of refrigerators contributed to a broader credibility crisis for communist governments. Citizens who had been promised that socialism would eventually outproduce capitalism in all areas were instead seeing the gap in living standards widen rather than narrow. The Prague Spring, while driven by multiple factors, included demands for economic reforms that would make consumer goods more widely available, a direct challenge to the centralized planning model that had failed to deliver on its promises. The Soviet refrigerator story took a dramatic turn in the late 1960s as Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, who had replaced Khrushchev in 1964, faced a critical strategic choice. The ongoing arms race was consuming enormous resources, while the space program, though prestigious, offered few tangible benefits to ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, consumer dissatisfaction was growing. Brezhnev ultimately chose a middle path, continuing military spending while significantly increasing investment in consumer goods production, particularly household appliances. This decision marked a fundamental shift in Soviet priorities, an implicit acknowledgement that the regime's legitimacy now depended not just on international prestige, but on delivering material improvements to its citizens. By 1970, the Soviet Union had dramatically increased refrigerator production to over 5.6 million units annually, a tenfold increase from 1960. New factories opened in Minsk, Riga, and Tbilisi, producing models with names like Mir, Saratov, and Biryusa. While still lagging behind American production in both quality and quantity, this increase meant that refrigerators finally began appearing in ordinary Soviet homes in significant numbers. Waiting lists shortened from years to months in major cities, though rural areas still lagged substantially behind. This progress came with significant economic consequences. Resources directed toward consumer goods meant less investment in industrial modernization, creating a hidden cost that would undermine Soviet economic competitiveness in later decades. Additionally, the Soviet approach to increasing production prioritized quantity over quality or innovation. While American manufacturers were introducing new features like automatic ice makers, adjustable shelving, and frost-free freezers, Soviet models remained basic, often suffering from quality control issues and short operational lifespans. For Soviet consumers, however, even basic refrigerators represented a revolution in daily life. Women who bore the primary responsibility for food shopping and preparation in Soviet society found themselves freed from daily shopping trips. The ability to store perishable foods transformed meal planning and nutrition. Seasonal fruits and vegetables could be preserved longer, improving winter diets. Children could enjoy luxuries like ice cream at home. These changes, while seemingly minor from an American perspective, represented significant quality-of-life improvements for Soviet families. The impact extended beyond domestic convenience to deeper social patterns. Food shopping in the Soviet Union had traditionally been a highly social activity, with consumers exchanging information about which stores had received shipments of scarce goods. The daily shopping ritual created community connections but consumed enormous collective time. As refrigerator ownership spread, shopping patterns gradually shifted toward less frequent, larger purchases, subtly altering social relationships and time use in ways that parallel earlier American experiences. Politically, the Soviet leadership hoped increased refrigerator production would satisfy consumer demands without requiring fundamental economic reforms. The strategy reflected a new social contract taking shape under Brezhnev. Citizens would accept political stagnation and limited freedoms in exchange for gradually improving material conditions. This refrigerator communism prioritized stability and incremental improvements in living standards over revolutionary transformation or economic experimentation. The strategy showed initial success. By the mid-1970s, approximately 65% of urban Soviet households had refrigerators, still below American levels, but representing genuine progress. Consumer satisfaction surveys showed increasing contentment with material conditions, particularly among younger generations with no memory of wartime hardships. The most acute phase of the refrigerator crisis had passed, though other consumer goods, automobiles, quality clothing, electronics, remained scarce and highly coveted. However, the apparent success concealed deeper structural problems. Soviet refrigerator production relied on increasingly outdated technology and inefficient manufacturing processes. A 1974 internal assessment from the Soviet Ministry of Machine Building for Light and Food Industry noted, "Our refrigerator models are now 10 to 15 years behind world standards in energy efficiency, reliability, and manufacturing cost." Modernization would require complete retooling of production lines and significant hard currency expenditure for Western technology. Such investments were repeatedly deferred as resources were directed toward military priorities and expanding production of existing models. The refrigerator gap also highlighted broader disparities in electric power infrastructure. While American homes were wired to accommodate multiple high-wattage appliances simultaneously, Soviet apartments often had limited electrical capacity. Power outages remained common in many regions, particularly during peak demand periods. A Soviet refrigerator owner in Tashkent recounted, "We finally received our Biryusa after 3 years on the waiting list, only to find our building's electrical system couldn't handle the load when several apartments ran refrigerators simultaneously. We developed an informal schedule with neighbors for when each apartment would run their unit." American observers, particularly in the intelligence community, closely monitored Soviet consumer goods production as an indicator of systemic health. A 1976 CIA analysis concluded, "The Soviet regime has succeeded in significantly increasing refrigerator availability, which has temporarily reduced consumer dissatisfaction. However, this has been achieved through brute force expansion of production rather than efficiency improvements or innovation. The approach is unsustainable given broader economic constraints and growing consumer expectations." This assessment proved prescient. By the late 1970s, Soviet consumers who had celebrated their first refrigerator acquisition were increasingly comparing their models unfavorably to Western alternatives, glimpsed through limited media exposure or rare travel opportunities. Expectations continued rising faster than the system could satisfy them. While refrigerator ownership had addressed one source of consumer dissatisfaction, it paradoxically created new discontent as citizens began expecting wider consumer choice and better quality. The refrigerator story intersected with Cold War diplomacy in unexpected ways. When the Helsinki Accords were signed in 1975, increasing information flow between East and West became an international commitment. While Soviet leaders focused on the recognition of post-war boundaries, the human rights and information provisions would have far-reaching consequences. Increased cultural exchanges, expanded international broadcasting, and greater movement of people and publications all contributed to Soviet citizens' awareness of Western living standards, refrigerators included. American strategic communications increasingly highlighted the material quality of everyday life rather than abstract freedoms. Voice of America broadcasts included segments on American household technology and food abundance. When the U.S. participated in international exhibitions in Moscow or other Eastern Bloc cities, displays emphasized practical consumer benefits rather than luxury goods. This approach recognized that for many Soviet citizens, the ability to store food conveniently held more immediate appeal than political rights they had never experienced. As détente progressed in the 1970s, increasing numbers of Soviet citizens gained first-hand exposure to Western living standards. Cultural exchanges expanded, diplomatic missions grew, and limited tourism opportunities emerged for privileged Soviets. Each returning traveler brought observations that contradicted official narratives about Western societies. While refrigerators were no longer shocking, visitors now remarked on the next generation of consumer electronics, automobile quality, and food variety. The credibility gap between propaganda and observed reality continued widening. For Soviet leaders, this created a no-win situation. Restricting information flow risked violating international agreements and would be interpreted as weakness. Allowing information while restricting consumer goods created political dissatisfaction. Increasing consumer production without fundamental economic reforms proved increasingly difficult as the inefficiencies of central planning accumulated. The refrigerator, once a symbol of future promise, now represented an ongoing reminder of the system's limitations. By the early 1980s, Soviet refrigerator production had plateaued around 6.8 million units annually. While impressive compared to 1960 levels, this represented a slowing of growth just as consumer expectations continued rising. Quality problems persisted, with a 1982 survey finding that 38% of Soviet-made refrigerators required service within the first year of operation. Supply chain issues meant replacement parts were often unavailable, leaving expensive appliances non-functional for extended periods. Meanwhile, American refrigerator technology continued advancing. Energy-efficient models emerged following the 1970s energy crisis, with consumption dropping by nearly 60% between 1972 and 1982. New features like water dispensers, ice makers, and temperature-controlled compartments became standard in mid-range models. Manufacturing efficiency improvements kept prices relatively stable despite inflation. The technology gap between American and Soviet refrigerators widened rather than narrowed, defying Khrushchev's earlier prediction of catching and surpassing American consumer technology. This stagnation contributed to broader disillusionment with the Soviet economic model. Citizens who had accepted limitations in the 1950s with the promise of future abundance now saw that promise indefinitely deferred. The generation that came of age in the 1970s and early 1980s, future leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev, increasingly recognized that systemic reforms were necessary to meet rising consumer expectations. The refrigerator gap had evolved from a temporary embarrassment to a structural challenge threatening the system's long-term viability. When Gorbachev assumed leadership in 1985, he inherited an economy struggling to meet basic consumer demands despite decades of promises. His reforms, particularly perestroika, restructuring, explicitly aimed to shift resources from military production to consumer goods and services. In a revealing 1987 speech, Gorbachev specifically mentioned household appliances. We have fallen behind not just in quantity, but in quality and innovation. Our refrigerators consume twice the electricity of Western models while providing less reliable service. This is not a minor household issue, but a reflection of our broader economic challenges. The refrigerator story took another dramatic turn as glasnost, openness, policies allowed Soviet media to acknowledge previously hidden deficiencies. Newspapers began publishing critical articles about quality problems in domestic appliances and explicit comparisons with Western alternatives. A 1988 article in Izvestia boldly stated, "After 4 decades of development, our refrigerator industry still produces models that would have been considered outdated in America in the 1960s. This is not due to technical inability, but systematic problems in our approach to innovation and quality control." Such public acknowledgments would have been unthinkable during previous eras, when even factual reporting on consumer shortages could be considered anti-Soviet propaganda. The change reflected Gorbachev's recognition that credibility required acknowledging obvious realities. However, this transparency created its own problems. By publicly admitting system failures without immediately delivering improvements, the government further undermined its legitimacy in citizens' eyes. As Eastern European countries began breaking away from Soviet control in 1989, the material gaps in living standards played a significant role. East Germans crossing into West Berlin weren't just seeking political freedom, they were drawn by the visible prosperity of Western consumer society. Refrigerators, once a symbol of the future promised by socialism, now symbolized its failure to deliver on basic aspirations despite decades of sacrifice. The final chapter of the Soviet refrigerator story came with the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. As market reforms were implemented across the former Soviet states, Western appliance manufacturers quickly entered these new markets. Consumers with access to hard currency could suddenly purchase the latest models from European and American manufacturers, while domestic refrigerator factories struggled with outdated equipment and collapsing supply chains. Many Soviet-era plants closed entirely, unable to compete in the new economic environment. For ordinary citizens, this transition created both opportunities and hardships. Those who successfully navigated the economic changes gained access to previously unavailable consumer goods, including modern refrigerators. However, economic dislocations left many unable to afford these improvements, creating new inequalities that contradicted both communist ideals and the promised benefits of market reforms. The refrigerator, once a symbol of the system's failure to deliver universal prosperity, now became a marker of post-Soviet economic stratification. Looking back from our contemporary perspective, the Soviet refrigerator story illuminates several profound historical lessons. First, it demonstrates how seemingly mundane household technologies can become powerful symbols in ideological competitions. The refrigerator wasn't merely an appliance, but a tangible measure of which system better served ordinary citizens' needs. Its visibility in daily life made abstract economic arguments concrete and personally relevant. Second, the story reveals how consumer expectations, once raised, become politically significant forces. The Soviet leadership initially dismissed consumer goods as bourgeois distractions, but eventually recognized that regime legitimacy increasingly depended on delivering material improvements. The shift from revolutionary sacrifice to consumer satisfaction represented a fundamental transformation in the social contract between the Soviet state and its citizens. Third, the refrigerator gap highlighted structural weaknesses in centralized economic planning that would ultimately contribute to the Soviet system's collapse. The inability to efficiently produce and distribute desired consumer goods, despite genuine efforts in later decades, exposed fundamental limitations in the command economy approach. Without price signals, consumer feedback mechanisms, or competitive innovation, Soviet manufacturing struggled to meet evolving consumer demands. Fourth, the story demonstrates information's power in shaping public perceptions and expectations. Despite strict media controls, Soviet citizens gradually learned about Western living standards through various channels, cultural exchanges, foreign broadcasts, returning travelers, and international exhibitions. This awareness fueled rising expectations that the system ultimately couldn't satisfy, creating a credibility gap that undermined regime legitimacy. For the individuals who experienced this history directly, the refrigerator represented different things at different times. For Americans in 1960, it was simply a standard household convenience, unremarkable except when malfunctioning. For Soviet visitors that same year, it represented a shocking glimpse of capitalist abundance that contradicted decades of propaganda. For Soviet citizens in the 1970s, acquiring a refrigerator meant achieving a long-sought domestic milestone. For reformers in the 1980s, persistent refrigerator quality problems symbolized broader systemic failures requiring fundamental change. The human dimensions of this story extend beyond political symbolism to daily life improvements. Refrigeration technology transformed food preservation, nutrition, shopping patterns, and domestic labor across both societies, though at different rates. Women, primarily responsible for food preparation in both American and Soviet households during this period, experienced particularly significant changes in their daily routines as refrigerator ownership spread. American women, who already had refrigerators by 1960, were incorporating them into new suburban lifestyles. Weekly shopping trips to supermarkets replaced daily visits to neighborhood stores. Frozen foods and convenience items changed cooking practices. Entertaining evolved with refrigerated appetizers and desserts prepared in advance. These changes, celebrated in American women's magazines as domestic progress, represented a profound shift in household management that Soviet women would experience more gradually over subsequent decades. Soviet women, meanwhile, spent an estimated 14 to 20 hours weekly on food shopping alone in the pre-refrigerator era. The constant search for fresh produce, daily bread purchases, and management of limited food storage dominated domestic schedules. As refrigerators gradually became available, these hours could be redirected to other activities, whether additional work responsibilities, childcare, education, or rare leisure time. One Soviet woman recalled in a later interview, Receiving our refrigerator in 1973 was like gaining extra days in each month. The time I saved from daily shopping allowed me to finally complete my evening education program. The refrigerator gap also reflected different approaches to women's roles in society. Soviet ideology officially promoted women's equality and workforce participation, with state child care and communal dining facilities theoretically supporting this vision. In practice, however, most Soviet women worked full shifts in factories or offices while retaining primary responsibility for domestic labor, the famous double burden. American ideology emphasized women's domestic roles during this period, even as female workforce participation steadily increased. Yet American household technology actually reduced domestic labor demands more effectively than Soviet communal services, creating an ironic contrast between rhetoric and lived experience. For the political leadership on both sides, the refrigerator story contained lessons that shaped subsequent Cold War strategies. American officials recognized that highlighting everyday living standards, the kitchen debate approach, resonated more effectively with international audiences than abstract discussions of freedom or democracy. This understanding influenced public diplomacy efforts throughout the later Cold War period, with increased emphasis on practical quality-of-life comparisons rather than ideological arguments. Soviet leaders learned that technological achievements like space exploration, while generating international prestige, had limited impact on domestic legitimacy compared to visible improvements in everyday living conditions. The increased investment in consumer goods production under Brezhnev reflected this recognition, though implementation remained hampered by structural economic limitations. Later leaders like Gorbachev explicitly acknowledged that socialism's credibility required demonstrating superior ability to meet citizens' material needs, not just abstract future promises. The refrigerator's significance transcended Cold War politics to reflect broader questions about modernity and progress. Both American and Soviet societies embraced technological development as a central element of their vision for the future. However, they diverged in how that technology should be distributed and who should determine its forms. The American approach emphasized consumer choice and market-driven innovation, with companies competing to satisfy individual preferences. The Soviet approach prioritized rational planning and equitable distribution, with centralized decisions about which technologies deserved development resources. Neither approach fully achieved its ideals. American consumer abundance coexisted with significant inequality, with poor and minority communities often lacking access to the household technologies celebrated in mainstream media. Soviet centralized distribution theoretically ensured more equitable access, but created chronic shortages and quality problems that undermined the promise of universal prosperity. The refrigerator highlighted these contradictions in both systems, challenging each society's self-narrative about technological progress. As the Cold War ended, the refrigerator story entered historical memory with different meanings for different generations. For Americans who lived through the period, it reinforced narratives about consumer capitalism's triumph over centralized planning. For former Soviet citizens, reactions were more complex. Some viewed the refrigerator gap as evidence that socialism was fundamentally flawed, while others maintained that implementation failures, rather than conceptual weaknesses, explained the disparity. For younger generations with no direct experience of this history, the refrigerator story often seems surprising or even implausible. In our contemporary world of global manufacturing and widespread household technology, the idea that a major world power struggled to produce basic refrigerators challenges assumptions about technological development. This reaction highlights how thoroughly consumer expectations have been transformed by subsequent decades of globalization and technological diffusion. The refrigerator story illuminates broader patterns in how societies adopt and adapt to new technologies. Innovation rarely proceeds at uniform rates across different societies, creating temporary but significant gaps in everyday technology, These gaps, when visible through international contact, generate powerful impressions about relative development and system effectiveness. Similar patterns have appeared with subsequent technologies: television ownership in the 1970s, personal computers in the 1990s, smartphone adoption in the 2010s, each becoming a visible marker of development and a challenge to systems that lag in adoption. What makes the refrigerator particularly significant in this pattern is its direct connection to fundamental human needs. Unlike technologies that primarily provide entertainment or convenience, refrigeration transforms food preservation and nutrition, affecting health and daily subsistence. Its absence couldn't be dismissed as merely lacking a luxury. It represented a fundamental gap in household infrastructure that affected every meal and shopping decision. This concrete impact gave the refrigerator unique political significance compared to more discretionary technologies. The refrigerator gap story also reveals how consumer technologies became increasingly central to international competition as the Cold War progressed. While early Cold War rivalry focused primarily on military capabilities, space exploration, and industrial production, later phases saw increasing emphasis on quality of life and consumer satisfaction. This shift reflected broader changes in how political legitimacy was understood and measured, from power projection and national glory to citizen well-being and material comfort. By the 1980s, this transformation had progressed so far that Soviet leaders explicitly acknowledged that socialism's success would ultimately be judged by its ability to satisfy consumer desires, not just basic needs. Gorbachev's reforms represented a desperate attempt to reorient the Soviet system toward this consumer-focused legitimacy model while preserving central planning principles. The attempt's failure, culminating in the Soviet Union's dissolution, demonstrated how difficult this reorientation proved once consumer awareness and expectations had been globally shaped. The post-Soviet period brought a rapid influx of Western consumer goods, including refrigerators, into former Soviet territories. However, economic disruption meant many citizens couldn't afford these items despite their new availability. This created painful ironies: shop windows full of previously unavailable appliances that remained financially inaccessible to many citizens who had spent years on waiting lists during the Soviet era. One pensioner in Moscow remarked bitterly in 1993, "For 30 years they told us refrigerators were coming soon. Now they're everywhere, but my pension won't buy even the cheapest model." For Western manufacturers, the opening of post-Soviet markets represented significant opportunities, but also challenges. Consumers with limited purchasing power required more affordable models than typically sold in Western Europe or North America. Electrical systems in Soviet-era apartment buildings often couldn't support the power requirements of larger Western refrigerators. Distribution networks had to be built essentially from scratch in regions where consumer appliance retail had been strictly controlled by state organizations. Companies that successfully navigated these challenges found substantial markets. By the late 1990s, international brands dominated refrigerator sales across the former Soviet territories, with domestically manufactured models largely disappearing, except in the lowest price segments. This transition symbolized the broader integration of these economies into global consumer markets, though often on disadvantageous terms, that reinforced economic dependency rather than development. The refrigerator story contains insights relevant to contemporary international development efforts. Technologies that transform daily life, whether refrigerators in the 20th century or mobile phones and internet access in the 21st, often diffuse unevenly across different societies, creating visible disparities that influence perceptions of relative progress. These technological gaps can generate political pressures on governments struggling to meet rising consumer expectations shaped by global awareness. Development strategies that prioritize visibly improving household technologies may generate greater public support than approaches focused on industrial infrastructure or institutional development, even when the latter might create stronger foundations for long-term growth. The Soviet experience suggests that neglecting consumer-facing technologies for too long risks undermining regime legitimacy, regardless of other achievements. Conversely, the American experience demonstrates how widespread access to household technologies can reinforce system legitimacy, despite other socioeconomic problems. The refrigerator's role as a Cold War symbol also demonstrates how ordinary household objects can acquire extraordinary political significance in certain historical contexts. The refrigerator wasn't inherently political. It became politically charged because it represented fundamental differences in how competing systems approached production, distribution, and consumption. Similar processes continue today with technologies like smartphones, social media platforms, and electric vehicles, which acquire political meanings beyond their functional purposes. For historians studying this period, Soviet and American refrigerators provide valuable material artifacts that illuminate broader social and economic patterns. Surviving refrigerator models from both countries reveal different approaches to design, durability, energy efficiency, and feature prioritization. Advertisements and user manuals demonstrate how each society conceptualized these appliances and their place in domestic life. Production statistics and distribution records quantify the growing but persistent gap between American and Soviet ownership rates throughout the Cold War period. The refrigerator story also highlights the importance of household technology in women's history specifically. In both societies, women held primary responsibility for food shopping, preservation, and preparation, making refrigerator access particularly consequential for their daily lives and time allocation. The gendered impact of refrigerator availability deserves recognition alongside the technology's broader political significance, demonstrating how household innovations could reshape women's domestic responsibilities and opportunities, regardless of official gender ideologies. As we conclude this historical examination, several key insights emerge. First, the seemingly mundane technology of household refrigeration became an unexpected battleground in the Cold War competition between capitalism and communism. What Americans considered an unremarkable household necessity became a powerful symbol of systemic differences when Soviet visitors encountered its ubiquity in ordinary homes. This discovery challenged Soviet propaganda narratives and created pressure for increased consumer goods production that strained central planning capabilities. Second, the refrigerator story demonstrates how visibility and personal experience could undermine even strictly controlled information environments. Soviet authorities could regulate official reports and censor media, but they couldn't prevent returning visitors from sharing observations with family and friends. These personal communications created an alternative information network that gradually eroded official credibility regarding comparative living standards and system capabilities. Third, the refrigerator gap illuminates how consumer expectations, once established, become politically significant forces that governments ignore at their peril. The Soviet leadership initially dismissed consumer desires as bourgeois materialism, but eventually recognized that regime legitimacy increasingly depended on satisfying these desires. This shift from revolutionary sacrifice to consumer satisfaction represented a fundamental transformation in how socialist legitimacy was understood and measured, a transformation that ultimately contributed to the system's demise. Finally, the refrigerator's significance extended beyond politics to transform everyday life in profound ways. Food preservation, shopping patterns, nutrition, domestic labor allocation, and meal preparation all changed as refrigerator ownership spread, first in America and later in the Soviet Union. These changes affected women particularly significantly, altering how they allocated time between shopping, food preparation, and other activities. The technology's impact on daily existence gave political symbolism concrete meaning in citizens' lived experience. The Soviet tourists who couldn't believe every American home had a refrigerator in 1960 weren't merely observing an appliance. They were witnessing a fundamental disparity in how effectively competing systems delivered technological benefits to ordinary citizens. Their shock reflected the gap between Soviet propaganda claims and observed reality, between promised future prosperity and American present abundance. This disparity would haunt Soviet leaders for the remaining decades of the Cold War, shaping policy priorities, resource allocation, and ultimately contributing to the system's growing legitimacy crisis. As American and Soviet citizens gradually gained more accurate understanding of each other's societies through increased information flow, the refrigerator became just one of many points of comparison in evaluating competing systems. Yet, its fundamental connection to daily sustenance and its visibility in ordinary homes gave it special significance. Long after ideological arguments faded, the concrete reality of who had reliable food preservation technology and who didn't remained a powerful testimony to which system better served its citizens' basic needs.